All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's SVDX webinar. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of SVDX. For those of you unfamiliar with our organization, we are a nonprofit dedicated to education and networking programs for boards of directors. We oftentimes will partner with various entities around the Bay Area, and today we're very pleased to be co-sponsoring today's session with Codex, which is the Center for Legal Informatics at Stanford University. So thank you to Roland Vogel and the team there for helping us get this session live. Today's session will be 1 hour long. Our topic today is government services and technology. We know that's a very broad topic, but our wonderful panelists will be bringing some really interesting issues to light, and I think it will be a very engaging conversation. Our session, again, is 1 hour in length, 60 minutes. We encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom, and our moderator will be folding those questions in throughout the session. And finally, we will be recording today's session, which will be available on our website in the coming weeks. So it is really my pleasure today to introduce our wonderful esteemed panelists. I'm going to give very brief introductions before we start today's webinar. Tony Lai is an entrepreneurial fellow at the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, Codex, and co-founder of Legal.io. He is also co-chair of the Codex Stanford Blockchain Group, and he's on the board of directors for Shareable, the leading media outlet for the sharing economy. Megan Moore is managing director in the Government Affairs Division at Finsbury Glover Herring. She helps clients navigate complex situations, understand the political and policy landscape, and communicate effectively. Prior to joining FGH, Megan was a special advisor to Federal Housing Finance Agency Director Mel Watt, and also served as the acting senior associate director for the Office of Congressional Affairs and Communications. Jeff Long is the global chief innovation officer at Ernst & Young. He brings deep experience across strategy, investing, and building new ventures globally. Jeff sits on the Oxford Foundry Board, Oxford University, and the advisory board for AI for All, a nonprofit organization working to increase diversity and inclusion in artificial intelligence. He's also a member of the Forbes Technology Council. Our moderator for today, Dan Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO, founder, and entrepreneur. He's currently co-chair of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, chairman of SVDX, board member of the Latino Corporate Directors Education Foundation, and a fellow at Stanford University. So with that, I will pass the mic over to Dan to kick off our webinar today.
Great, thanks, Nancy. This is a super exciting panel. It is the widest, most ambiguous topic we've tackled in a while. So I think that's going to be the hardest part. And so with that, I'm going to put Megan on the spot because you live in a world in which you have to translate big ideas into definitive action, heaven forbid, regulatory wording, legislation, or advice to big corporations. So, you had in our preparations kind of discussed a little bit of a framework. It doesn't have to be a binding one, but I wonder if you might describe for us the way to think about the intersection of government and modern or advanced technology. And let us start there and we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, well, thanks, Dan, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. I'm really excited to spend some time with you guys this morning or afternoon on the East Coast. And it's a new intersection in Main Street, USA, of government and technology. It's probably an intersection that a lot of us wish was bigger, but it is something new. And, it's kind of, you have government and innovation, I would say, kind of replacing technology. And how do you assess those challenges and opportunities? From a government perspective, I think the challenge is always how do you manage this disruption and meet it with appropriate regulation? And, governments, particularly regulators, you always carry the last crisis with you into the future. And you never want to over-regulate, but you do carry the past in to make sure that you're not, putting forth regulations or, framework or guardrails that might, make the government, but more importantly, taxpayers vulnerable to technology that maybe doesn't always protect them. But it's very challenging. Like, how can you be a forward-thinking government and also harness technology? And I think that you've seen that work better in some areas or not. There were a couple of case studies I was going to mention about how And Dan, I don't know if you want me to go into that now.
I think we'll save them, but it's what, so we're going to do IRS and cryptocurrency and maybe a couple others, but we'll definitely talk, like brass tacks about some recent stuff. So let's hold that because I want to come back to it.
I think really the framework is like, how does government manage the disruption and the regulation? How do you manage the ability to have innovation while protecting taxpayers? And also you have, a partisan legislative branch that approaches these issues from their perspective as well. So I think there's a lot of promise. I think that with some of the financial technology companies that have come on, and particularly online lenders and fintechs, I think there's a promise of innovation and access. But also I think there's sometimes frustration when the innovation doesn't deliver in the way that the government wants. So I think we'll get into this a lot, but I think it's really like managing disruption and managing the regulation of that industry and that innovation.
Great. And part of what I'm also going to extract from you, and I know it'll be in the IRS example, is the true delivery of services. Like I'm going to ask maybe Jeff and Tony and you, Megan, to give us examples of it's good, it's bad, it's in between, the use of technology and delivery of actual, services, whether, sophisticated, complicated creation of public goods to, do you use other than paper checks? Thankfully, we've gotten that, for delivering a benefit. So, Nancy, before we do that, we want to get kind of a level set sense of, everyone's view of this. So, just, your impression right now about whether or not the government is effective at using technology to deliver services. Now, that's a very wide open, question, and, it's open to interpretation. Well, let's see what people kind of just say as a level set. We'll let 25 or so people answer. It's early enough.
I hope you don't mind, Dan. I answered too.
Oh yeah, no, you're allowed. Absolutely. That's great. That's great. So we'll cut it off right here. Perfect. Okay, we got 25. Well, we've got one genuine government optimist. I don't know. I'll have to scan the attendees, see who maybe they work for the government and they're the ones delivering that technology. But by and large, it looks like people are kind of neutral to disagreeing or strongly disagreeing about whether or not, the vast majority feel neutral to strongly disagree that the government's delivering services using technology effectively. So let's get to a broader question for a moment and then we'll narrow it back down. And I'm happy, maybe Jeff, you go first, but then I'll ask Tony and Megan to jump in. And that is, can you pick one or two areas, and if you want to mention a third, you can mention it, we'll come back to it, but don't spend too much time on it, that you think this intersection of government and technology, where it shows up and matters, either to business, to boards, to whatever you think is a big deal.
Well, one thing that we're seeing more around the world than in the US that I think is going to matter a lot to businesses and boards is that intersection of tax collection and advanced technology and plugging in directly into companies' ERP systems. We're seeing this in other parts of the world, Mexico, Brazil, et cetera, where governments are basically doing what we have in terms of real estate here, where they send you the tax bill and you just pay the tax bill, and they're plugging basically in directly to the ERP systems. We're also seeing from the ERP system vendor side, them building the links in so that the governments can come in and just sort of one-click it and say, okay, what does this company owe me? That's a very, very different system and process than exists today here in the US. And while it is earlier in the rest of the world, I think it's an important development for businesses and boards to think about. On the other side of it, Dan, and I'll just touch on it here, which is what we know is the world is moving really, really quickly and is changing quickly, which is why this topic is particularly interesting now if we look back throughout the last several decades. When do you want to really ask this specific question of this panel? I think now is an interesting, very, very interesting time to do it, maybe the most interesting time. Most notably, I think we've all known the dialogue around artificial intelligence and so the impact on the world and the question around trust and ethics around AI. But now what we've seen is a remarkable set of traction acceleration around blockchain, cryptocurrencies, those fun words, DAO and DeFi. With that, governments around the world are recognizing that in essence, an entire financial system is being created to be the exact reverse of everything that they've done historically. They create central banks, central regulation, control at the middle of all the governments around the world. And now you have a technical and mathematical construct that is meant to be the exact reverse of that. How does the government interact with that? I think that's a really interesting question for boards and C-suites to observe and think about in a significant way.
And we'll dig into some of the opportunities and risks around that as we get a little further in the webinar. And I'll also mention, like, we might come back to this again, this idea of where can efficiency really drive benefit to people, to the economy, et cetera. You know, I know that there was a Tax Foundation study from 2012, and it was updated for 2020, that showed that roughly 4 billion hours were spent by individuals each year on preparing tax forms, right? The effective annual cost is about $50 billion. This is preparation. This isn't compliance. This isn't collection. It's actual preparation and filing. And so one imagines that if you could solve some of that, you know, that actually moves the needle, right? I mean, if you can basically give back a week of everyone's year, that does a lot. And averages are deceiving, right? So maybe the top 10% is, you know, consuming a lot of time, but we'll come back to that, I think. So maybe Tony, why don't you kind of give us your view on the intersections where you think these technologies and government services or compliance or any of the above matters?
Well, thank you so much, Dan, and it's great to be here with everyone. I think I'll start first with just talking a little bit about this intersection between law and technology that we dig into so deeply at Codex. And obviously, when thinking about government and technology, the role of law as a sort of service provider that the government provides is bound up with this sort of wider ecosystem of legal services and justice that corporations, individuals, we all use as part of this process of coordinating with each other in order to operate society and the economy. Now, the exciting thing that we see at Codex is as technology is being brought into different kinds of aspects of the legal system, we're seeing that sort of flow out and into obviously the way that people can potentially relate to the notion of regulation. And obviously government is our primary regulator. We see government at the federal, the state, the local level. But what we're also starting to see is that regulation is being in some way taken on by corporations themselves. We're obviously seeing that with big tech, with talk of sort of Facebook and Twitter regulating their content framework. And obviously, as companies start taking on the approaches to thinking about ecosystems and how their users interact with each other, the kinds of technologies that can be used to do that, to monitor, to collect data, and to, in a sense, coordinate using these forms of technology and rules, we're seeing that flow out into all these different areas where legal traditionally potentially didn't have a role within the corporation. Things like trust and safety, things like compliance and regulation, where technology is being used more and more. And we're seeing the rise of a whole field called legal operations, which is essentially beyond the purview of the general counsel, and really something that the CFO is taking a much deeper interest in as part of the efficiency of the corporation as a whole. And so I think that's definitely one thing we'll see, is legal services taking the same route as technology services did in the 90s and the early 2000s, when management consultancies came in and found ways to sort of bring technology to enable an entire corporation to operate in a more sort of functional, maybe more agile way. So composable technology is going to be matched with something we're starting to see called composable governance. And then that, of course, then brings us into the whole world of blockchain and DAOs that Jeff mentioned, because I think that's the second key thing that I'd love our audience to pay attention to, is the potential for blockchain and DAOs, not just for speculation and for cryptocurrencies and all of the things related to finance that we've seen thus far in the blockchain world, but really how blockchain and DAOs can really unpack the way that law operates, the way that rules and social coordination in all its different forms can operate. And I think government has a huge beneficial role to play in understanding this potential for coordination, because obviously government's one of the biggest coordinators of them all. And I think the role of government in thinking about polycentric governance, where governance is taking a different role in all of these different kinds of coordinated entities, including corporations and nonprofits and community organizations, I think that's some of the potential that I'd love to dig into more, but obviously we've only got a limited amount of time, and I could talk all day about these kind of things.
No, that's a great start. And I think we'll weave it in. I do want to encourage participants to submit questions, because we'll kind of integrate those into the conversation as we go along. We've already got a couple, and I'll make sure we address those. But before we do that, I want to go to Megan, though. Megan, you don't have to be redundant if you don't want to be, and I will plant one seed, which is, I don't know about you, but my kind of civil liberties hackles go up a little bit. Like this is on the one hand, I'm super excited about efficiency and transparency and the kind of immutable transparency that arises out of the things that both Tony and Jeff described. But on the other hand, there are versions of government where I'm not super happy with the government having that, right? It depends on the day and maybe the administration or maybe the country, right, the jurisdiction. So we can come back to that later. But if you want to weave that into your answer, I know you have thoughts around that. But what one or two things might you highlight, or feel free to answer my civil liberties paranoia if you like.
Yeah, well, it's interesting just looking back at my notes too, because as government tries to innovate and bring new technologies online, it will displace some type of industry function. And I think that's a very interesting piece as well. And Dan, I know we talked, I think back about like mortgages and the experience, and like as you try to bring more efficiency to that process, you will displace someone. You think about automatic appraisals, automatic valuations. You think about these ways to kind of wring out those frictions. But then the opposite reaction is like, well, government, why are you in a better position to tell us how to harness that technology? And then on the opposite side, it will displace, potentially, someone in the industry who's been providing, this service. So I think it sometimes can paralyze the government from trying to harness the technology, but also respond to the industry as well. And I think particularly as it relates to government services, we want to have that efficiency, but sometimes that efficiency means maybe government is moving too fast and they're moving at a pace that we're not comfortable with as taxpayers. And also we know the pendulum kind of shifts. So maybe I'm okay with Dan innovating and going fast and wringing out these frictions, but maybe I'm not comfortable with Jeff doing that because sometimes they might have a different view or opinion of it. So I think there's always this tension there.
You made the right choice, Megan. I just want to say.
Although I'm pretty sure Jeff could solve all these problems, but there's always that tension there, and a lot of efficiency can bring disruption. And I think people don't fully appreciate that. And I think as your role as board of directors and aspiring directors, how can you direct your company to almost operate in parallel with government? And I think industry can really bring the government along. And now it may take a little longer. It's a more methodical process, but I do think there's a lot that both groups can learn from each other as we try to bring, these efficiencies online. But it's like when you push one thing out, something goes out on the other side, and you have to be mindful of that. And probably someone cares what you just pushed out on the other side.
Yeah. So it's, everyone's efficiency emergence is someone else's loss of business in a way.
Absolutely.
Right? Because you're probably plugging a gap. And maybe that's a good segue to talk about the IRS example. And we can all talk about it because I think there's elements that you've each reflected on. But Megan, do you want to set that up? I mean, there's a recent kerfuffle, you might say, where on the one hand, it looked like, the government was trying to do the right thing, but on the other hand, it didn't go so well. And then there was kind of backing up. So maybe lay the groundwork for us.
Yeah. Well, this is interesting. For folks who may be following, the IRS, I think, is the agency that we love to hate in some instances. And, IRS played a big role in President Biden's push on the human infrastructure side. If you give the IRS more money, more enforcement tools, they can close the tax gap. And then we have more individuals than corporations, paying their fair share. So it's very interesting. So the IRS tried to bring on board facial recognition software, and they wanted to adopt this new technology to really enhance security and allow taxpayers to verify, their identity. I have an iPhone. At first we used our fingerprint. Now we use our face. And if people watched SNL over the weekend, Amazon now has stores where you walk in, you can grab something, walk out, and it's just all facial recognition. And so I think that trying to allow taxpayers to benefit from this technology, it got an immediate backlash, and not just from one side.
I want to throw out something because I think you take it for granted because I think you live this, but that, identity verification problem within the IRS for, your average taxpayer is a huge problem. It's a multi-billion-dollar problem that isn't just about money, but it kind of wrecks people's lives for a while. You can be made whole and you still have to fix a bunch of stuff. And we won't get into the ways in which, fraudsters engage around that, but it is centered on a type of identity theft. And it really does wreak havoc. If you were waiting on an earned income tax credit, you were just hanging on, maybe you're a single mother, you're working, like this could blow up your life. And so it was not a frivolous endeavor. It was a big problem, that they were trying to solve. And so, sorry, go from there. I wanted to lay that out.
No, I think you're right. Yeah. And then as soon as they try to lean in and solve that problem, they got their hands slapped by everyone, from activists, from the left, from the right. And, to your point too, the efficiency, that was an $86 million contract. And we allowed the IRS to spend this money. And I thought it was very interesting. People from all sides basically were like, don't do this. And it was almost like you almost wasted that investment. And I think it's like just really reflects the latest challenges for the IRS. They have a backlog of returns. Whatever you do, do not file your return by paper. They have decades of underfunding. But I thought this was very interesting that the second they try to embrace technology and embrace that efficiency, everyone was like, whoa, slow down. And I thought it was, I know the IRS, once again, you don't want auditors and people showing up to your door and having that enforcement, but arguably this is how we receive, funding for the government. The IRS is a major player here. And I thought it was interesting, like biometric data is very, very widely used. This was used to increase security, not to compromise privacy. They spent $86 million as a 2-year contract. And as soon as they wrote it out, they basically had to take it off the table. And I think this is a perfect example of trying to be efficient in government services and having everyone respond and saying, no, that's way too much, way too soon. You need to go back to an old school version.
Let's dissect that just a little bit. By the way, on your note about don't file paper returns, there's a question that no one's been able to get answered to my knowledge, which is sad, although I'm looking at a guy who has access to the right people. So if you have an 83B, which is near and dear to, 83B filer, which is near and dear to those of us in Silicon Valley, hopefully, you have to file by paper. So this bodes badly, but wait for it. They tried to get an answer, but they couldn't reach anyone. So we're working on that. But so Jeff, if your folks have that answer, we'll circulate that to everyone who's on the webinar. But I'd love for Tony and Jeff to weigh in on this. So this really is a very interesting case. We have what is moderately advanced technology, but it's not brand spanking new. Like this is deployed all over the place by private companies, by governments worldwide, you name it, right? Like if you've traveled internationally, you've walked through border checkpoints and you don't have to stop anymore on your way out sometimes, and sometimes on your way in if you're a frequent traveler, because everything recognizes you. So it's not that new. And it was solving a very specific problem. It was a bidded contract done by what went wrong, I guess, is my question. So maybe Tony and Jeff, you guys can weigh in and help us understand this government services. Someone thought this was a great idea, and yet, boom. So Jeff, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll jump in first because I'm off mute first, but I know Tony will have deep insights here as well. The fact is certain organizational structure, and this is actually interesting for broadly the participants to think about, certain organizational structures are not built to move at speed, right? They're built for different things. And I think that what you're seeing, what Megan's great example exhibits is under certain government constructs and the style and the way that we set up the checks and the balances and the voices that should be heard is phenomenal and has been phenomenal for our country overall. But when you ask, let's implement new advanced technologies, let's think about how we should regulate the world as it moves at the pace and speed it's going at, it doesn't really reflect the process by which it happens. It doesn't really reflect the speed of the world around us. And there's certain organizational structures. I know I'm just talking about government, but as we think about the different boards you sit on, there's certain organizational structures that don't reflect that, so that you need to rethink how the organization works if you want to move at speed and at pace and at scale, with the world around it. In this specific case, I think it really was fascinating, right? You see all the different voices that have a vote, so to speak, in terms of whether or not something gets implemented, and you see the hesitation of the world and sometimes in moving forward. We also see that, generally speaking, across organizations and societies. Change is hard. You're going to have a small group of people who really, really likes it and wanted all that facial recognition. And then you're going to have the masses that are going to say, wait, hold on, let's think about it. What I will say, again, for the benefit of the board members on here, is there's a lot of discussions that I see talking to C-suites and boards around the world where they're like, no, don't worry about it. It's government related, so it'll move way too slow. It'll be it won't be a problem. We're protected for many, many years. And Megan was very polite. We have our two biggest businesses are audit, assurance, and tax, right? Which are two industries that have significant technological advance possibilities associated with them. And so the thing I would ask everybody is to not get too comfortable. We are investing heavily in the next generation, the next version, the platforms that will support us in any world as it ends up. And I would say strategically, you can't depend on government to just be slow or just to wait. You have to be ready for that change, because the math says when that change happens, it'll happen fast, and perhaps faster than most organizations can move.
That's great. I'm going to ask Tony to chip in, but let me recap a couple items. So I want to come back to this a little later, but this idea of operating in parallel with government and being savvy about it, which Megan raised, I'd like to get a little bit more detailed about that a little bit later, and pairing that with this idea of you don't really have as much time as you once did. You cannot count on the slow motion nature of government, certainly in some areas, but not in others. And so that buffer is gone. And I will highlight as maybe an intro for Tony to expand on, only if you want. There are a lot of areas in which you view an efficiency and you think of it as quite wonderful because it fixes lots of problems, delays, asynchronicity, accuracy, and yet in practice you realize that you cause all sorts of problems. And so I once had a boss who was a lawyer who said, so long as you're 100% sure it'll be true by the end of the day, you can say soon enough, yes, if you're asked, is that the case, right? We can debate whether or not that was good advice, but it was interesting advice at the time. And it reflects a lot of things like in fintech. So one of the items that is a draw to blockchain and fintech type reconciliations is the immediate reconciliation, the instantaneous settlement, the clarity around that. And yet, we all know people who might write a check and then immediately go to the bank to deposit the check they've been carrying around in their pocket, right? They're not trying to float a check. And that little bit of grace is slowly evaporating, and eventually it will be completely gone. And so there's no wiggle room for any of the very human behaviors, which we tend to reconcile a lot of things after the fact. And so do businesses. If all of our grace and time is taken away, what happens to us? So anyway, I want to reflect on that because it changes the pace of board discussions and the like. But Tony, you can either dig into the nature of the speed of blockchain related reconciliation, or maybe just expand on why the IRS stumbled so badly.
Well, maybe I can do a version of both. The last point you made about speed of reconciliation is a really interesting segue into a discussion I was having with a fairly senior tax official in the UK. And he was looking at smart contracts and the potential of having tax automatically deducted at the moment of transfer, right? So similar to how pay-as-you-earn operates, and basically, the IRS basically takes care of the taxes you earn as an employee. If that were applied to the entire world of contracting and freelancing, what might that look like? And, that would be an incredible step change in terms of the lowering of the hassle required to deal with taxes, because it's all dealt with, upfront, and the capacity for the IRS to sort of collect and have that set up. Now, obviously, if you've got all of that, you're presumably assuming a certain level of transparency in terms of your own operations. And I think this is the point that you were making around, maybe a little bit of nervousness in terms of losing that gap of sort of fogginess. Now, I just want to turn it around for a moment, which is that I think that transparency point can also apply back towards the government. And I think it's really interesting when we look at this broader principle of transparency that's sort of part of this new wave of decentralized technologies, when it's applied to the government and maybe the other side of taxation, which is sort of procurement and government spending, we can sort of look at like an issue like the IRS spending a huge amount on a contract and think, if that were a little bit more open, if the process was, open to decentralized feedback, people maybe would have caught a lot of these sort of inherent sort of specificities of fear around surveillance that comes with facial recognition that resulted in San Francisco's government banning the use of facial recognition technology, a couple of years ago. You're seeing certain kinds of sort of ick factor, having to be taken into account. And the more agile sort of open procurement processes that sort of blockchain certainly sort of opens up sort of the avenue to, I think these can start to sort of speak to the ways in which government as a composable piece, which many people can take part in doing, oftentimes in parallel. Maybe you're setting up, these smart contracts to, create a tax for your particular, supply chain ecosystem. And that goes towards supporting, a commons of support within that supply chain. That's in a sense a parallel taxation ecosystem that any corporation is free to set up right now. And I'm sure Jeff would be very happy to advise any corporation looking to do something like that. But as these sorts of things happen, I think we're going to start to see governments looking at the ways that they can adopt these kinds of things, and we're going to see these systems maybe merging together. Maybe the private moving slightly ahead, but hopefully government will be able to play catch up a lot faster this time around.
Tony, just playing off of that, one of the quick examples is we did it for it was public, so it's Microsoft, their gaming royalties payment system. Exactly that. It's a whole series of payments amongst 3,000-4,000 different content providers. When you buy a game, everyone gets paid differently, all by contract, and you can build it into a blockchain network with a smart contract. So the instant a game is bought, everyone gets paid instantaneously. And to Megan's previous point, you eliminate the need for a lot of separate databases, separate data management, Excel spreadsheet management, and because we have Codex, as a co-sponsor, you eliminate the need for some lawyers and the resolution between the dispute of how much was actually sold and who gets paid what. So it is an interesting example that we see that the government has an opportunity to drive efficiency around a concept like that.
But the government also owns the success and the failure of that too, by allowing companies and setting forth regulation that allows this technology to be permissible. If something runs afoul, you're going to then go back and blame the government for allowing this to happen. And I think in the artificial intelligence piece, particularly national security, but also I think it's very interesting too, just the racial component of it as well. And we all know that the human bias is real. It could be in, national security, can also be in lending decisions. So I think as we try to leverage technology, harness the possibility, I think that a lot of people are also, concerned that it's either going to leave people out or it's going to adversely affect people. And I joked about the SNL skit, but you might be hesitant as a Black man to walk into this Amazon store, pick up your turkey sandwich, put it in your bag, and walk out the store. Like you said, it's permissible, but people are very hesitant on that as well. Or if there's certain ethnic minorities that are stopped at the border crossing. So I think it's the human part that builds these things. And once again, the government is going to be responsible both for the success and the failure of these technologies if they put forth regulations that make them permissible.
And before we queue up the next poll, I want to synthesize that because I think there's really great lessons for boards, corporations, and for the government. And that is kind of similar to in the United States, if you're a free speech advocate, if you're not happy with the current free speech, the better solution is more speech, right? So kind of riffing on Tony's point, if the deployment of new cutting edge technologies isn't going so well, maybe you should use technology to widen the lens, to create more transparency, to create more input that improves it, including, Megan, using your example, right? So it isn't so much, I think I'm hearing, that the technologies, shouldn't be allowed or so fundamentally problematic. It's really about transparency, refinement, and acceptance, iteration probably, and then deployment in a kind of careful, staged way, recognizing that government wasn't really designed always to be nimble, maybe hardly ever to be nimble, right? And when it is nimble, despite what we say, sometimes we're kind of discombobulated by that. Like we've relied on a sort of not super nimble thing. But final point, Tony, summarizing, the transparency can go in many directions, right? So I think there are very few people who would object to greater transparency and access to what the government does, spends, how they think. Like that tends to be a universally accepted good, right? Whether or not easy to access. So, okay, with that in mind, lots of stuff floating there. Let's do the next poll and then we'll come back. And this is a slightly tongue-in-cheek poll, but not completely. So you personally as a director or as a technologist, we've got a couple of entrepreneurs, the use of cutting edge and emerging technology by the government is, we're falsely making you select one. Obviously, personally, I would say I need to select at least two of these, maybe three. Let's just see what the overall reactions are and see where we are. I'm mildly pleased to see that there isn't broad-based fundamental skepticism about technology and government. So we only have a couple people opting into the what technology question. All right, there we are. So All right, I actually think this mimics the panel, right? Which is, listen, this is stuff that could be really great. It's super important. It's complicated, and there could be downsides. And okay, well, with that in mind, let me tackle a couple of the questions that have come up because they're nice segues to our other questions that we set up. I'm going to go out of order, though. I will try to get to all of them. So one of them was just about the practicality of what governments should do, whether they do the build or buy decision, right? This is a question that every organization faces: universities, government, enterprise. And I'm going to ask, maybe to start on this, Jeff, if you can give like your narrowest answer, but then I'm going to ask Megan to weigh in a little bit, and then I'm going to pull for the next part of that question. I'm going to pull Tony in. But first, Jeff, what's build or buy government? Is there like a rule of thumb, or is it depends? Which I hate that answer, but it might be the right one.
Well, it parallels, I think, the decisions by many boards, right? There are certain IP and sort of patentable things that you want to protect in terms of the specialization of your processes. If you're the IRS, the algorithm through which you decide who does an audit or who gets audited or who not. There's probably something pretty special in that secret sauce that you want to control and own, that you need to maintain that. But there's a lot that you should go out and buy, license, etc. What you recognize with the amount of money that's going through the private venture capital, PE, private credit industry, I think the current overhang or the current available capital is at $3 trillion globally, right? What you recognize is there's extraordinary talent going out after each of these interesting problems. And the expense of replicating something is very, very high if you're a single customer of it. So I would be really careful and thoughtful about where you have a particular IP requirement that you have to protect something versus you can license out and buy it from somebody else. And that sort of mirrors how we think about it as well here.
That's great. And so you almost described, Jeff, buy off the shelf, but if not, explain why. Like your default should really be in that direction. And the areas in which you might have some thoughtfulness are proprietary systems that are often related to enforcement or other compliance things where there is a government privacy interest at work, right? So that, I think that's a concise modern summary of it. And yet maybe my question to Megan is, why don't we see that more? And maybe it's unfair. Maybe the headlines are the ones that are the deviations from that and we get the wrong impression. But what does the government really do in this regard? Actually.
Yeah. It's actually very interesting because, Jeff, you use the word talent. And when I was in government, and this example isn't, proprietary, we're trying to solve the world's issues, but we did have this question about build versus buy. And I was a little bit more in the build camp because I wanted to increase our talent capabilities within the agency I was working at. And that's what my motivation was. I think that there was probably a company out there that probably had something off the shelf, would have solved our problem in a week. We would have gone on to the next thing. But as me, for an executive in an agency, I had to stop and think like, all right, well, if we build it ourselves, are we arming our staff to be smarter, to maybe compete a little bit more? Even if it may have taken, maybe 8 weeks to build it versus 1 week to buy it, am I creating a workforce that's more empowered? I'm increasing their talents, their skills. And for me, maybe that's just me in government. I think I'm a government gal. I believe in the safety net, but we're all just people. And you want to show up to work and feel like you're really providing value. And if I'm showing up to work and I'm just buying everyone else's technology and I'm just like pressure testing it, am I really like growing my muscle memory and being smarter? But that was just the example. I won't say which one. It was very minor. But for me as an executive, I think it's also important to build your workforce and to increase your own capabilities. Now, there are some instances where buying it makes sense, but then once again, the government's on the hook. If I bought it from Jeff or Tony, you're not really going to be on the hook. I'm going to be on the hook. Megan, why did you do a contract with them and they fell short? And now I'm bringing you up to the hill to testify. I'm the one to blame. So I think sometimes that makes government moving even slower because we own, once again, the success and the failure of these technologies. And sometimes people just want to be a little bit more methodical about it. But from my perspective, I always thought about building the talent within the agency. If we can build something and then we own it and we can maybe deploy it across different agencies and we're better as a government for it.
That's great. I'm going to keep us moving to get to some of the really good questions. Other than my synthesis on that one is, it turns out governing is really hard. so like it's really difficult.
I just like to say one quick thing.
I want you
yeah, just very quickly.
The blockchain question. Go ahead. Add to that, and then I'm going to ask a follow-up immediately. Go ahead.
Well, I want to jump in because what Megan just said deeply rhymes with a bias that I have, which is that governments building infrastructure should build open source infrastructure, and if they should buy from an open source vendor who's going to train them in like maintaining and updating an open source code base. Because I think that this principle of having public infrastructure, especially digital infrastructure, be open source builds upon this broader notion of what government is about, which is building for the public good. And we're starting to see some wonderful organizations that sort of tap into governments who are doing this. There's an organization called the Foundation for Public Code that goes to cities that have built an open source project and essentially port that over, because obviously taking an open source project and sort of like putting it in situ, you can't do that straight away, but there's teams and resources that, in a sense, there's a bit of a mix between buy and build, because you're taking something sort of off the shelf, but you're learning about it, you're building, and it's going to be there for others to use as well. So
I'm so glad you interjected that. I don't often say that, by the way, but I'm so glad you did that. And I'm also like big light bulb on this. So it's interesting. What you just described is the compromise between the efficiency of buying off the shelf and the need to develop, because you don't have to own it from soup to nuts. You are a contributor in an open source environment in a disciplined, sort of patterned way that has very structured norms. And so, Megan can develop her key staff and they can have meaningful contributions. And yet, even though politically you own it, you don't own it, right? So that's such an interesting, we might have to do a whole session on just that. Like that is a really interesting view, which obviously open source is now a standing norm, but for government, I like that principle. We might come back to that. What I want you to though very quickly weigh in on, Tony, is the question of blockchain and the use of blockchain for public registries. The easy ones are property related to the United States, like title, but there's also marriage, divorce. There's all sorts of things. It ranges from the obvious and relatively public anyway to the private and perhaps a little bit disconcerting, but huge efficiency. What's your take on that in terms of the use of blockchain? And I'll cede one step. I'll play Joe Grunfest in this. At Stanford, blockchain, schmockchain. Sure, you need it, but sometimes you just need a better database. Why don't we just have them use a better database? But yeah, maybe you can incorporate that.
So I'm going to jump straight into a use case that we're studying right now at Stanford through the blockchain group in a partnership with the Woods Institute for the Environment and the Distributed Trust Initiative at Stanford, which is about carbon accounting registries. And so here's a really interesting one that governments definitely are playing a role in, certainly at the nation state level. But what we've got currently in terms of the nation state accounting process is just taking into account nation states. Now, obviously, governments operate at various different levels. There's cities that are sort of like looking to start to measure and account for what's happening with there. There's corporations there, and the states getting on the action. California, there's a legislative bill called SB 260, which is going to potentially require all companies over $1 billion who do business in California to register their sort of scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions. And scope 3 includes within your supply chain. So once you've got this kind of framework, that's where a traditional database really would not do. Who's going to be maintaining that? Can you trust that one country versus another is not going to fiddle their books lightly? This is a perfect use case for a distributed blockchain database, a registry that obviously we can start piecemeal, but as long as we're building on the basis of these kinds of open source principles with the right kinds of standards and data interoperability, we have a chance at creating something that could actually start keeping track of the carbon emissions and carbon drawdown that different cities, states, bioregions, nation states, and areas beyond national jurisdictions like the oceans, how that all fits together. So there's one example that we're very excited about.
That's a fantastic example. And there's a third point to a series of questions. You actually answered part of the first question, and we'll get back to kind of dark money issues in a bit if we can. There's a third question, which I love this question, but sadly, if you are a recovering law professor like me, there's a very simple answer and straightforward to it, which is, the nearly existential risk of a federal system is the fact that the states do not generally coordinate. And the upside is that you have all these wonderful simultaneous experiments. The downside is you have very little coordination. There is this idea of federal preemption, which is wonderful, but doesn't always apply. And generally data sharing, not so much. So that's a kind of snarky answer answer to the question about, hey, do the US states like coordinate? Not so much, but the federal government can play a coordinating feature, which kind of brings us back to another question which came up, and I'm happy for anyone to answer. We probably won't let Tony not answer, at least. And that is this idea of a distributed ledger, right, with coordination. Again, other examples where you think we have low-hanging fruit that would be accepted publicly, where we can get better coordination for government activity using a blockchain. So Tony gave a couple examples, which I think are great. I think the climate side is particularly exciting. We've got the obvious ones, which are in real estate. But where else can you imagine that you see government, let's hope they do some open sourced information sharing, so it's accepted, but where could government move the needle on general ledger blockchain type sharing of information? Any thoughts or ideas?
So one thing where they are, and I don't know if the group will think this is good or bad. I actually love Tony's example. I think ESG and carbon measuring, particularly when you go globally, we have a whole series of investments to support this, including in our own blockchain software infrastructure because of that. And that is the seminal use case right now. The other place that we're seeing this from governments, and Dan, I'm not saying this is good or bad, I'm just saying it is around currencies. So you're seeing, digital currencies being launched by different governments around the world. And it follows some blockchain features, but it does follow some traceability, trackability features. And you can say whether it's good or bad or whatnot, but I imagine we know what the governments are, and there will be some enforcement of the usage of it that will allow the governments to trace who's using what, when, and where. Now, obviously, the argument from the government side is that the elimination of fraud, they're able to track every transaction down to the, buy at the retail register level, and they can protect the consumer in significant ways. And there's obviously the other side of the argument as well. But that's the other use case that I'm seeing. Again, not arguing if it's good or bad.
That's great. I have a follow-up. I want to let Megan and Tony weigh in. Go ahead, Megan, please.
No, I think that's right. And since you kind of introduced digital assets, that was kind of another example where, people are still trying to figure out the opportunity and the risk. And I think particularly what you've seen in the last couple of days is there's now like a rift between Democrats about that opportunity and risk, where you have some Democratic lawmakers who are very critical of the industry, are concerned, even like with what's happening, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Can it be compromised? Is there money laundering? Is there illicit finance? And it's like, whoa, like, how did we get from opportunity to illicit finance? And then you have another group of members, particularly Black and Hispanic members of Congress, who are saying, and I think, I can't remember if it was Tony or Jeff, like, we now are having a decentralized financial system and minorities will benefit from it, hopefully. We're now setting up a new structure that hopefully doesn't have that institutional and structural racism to it. So if we're building this from the ground up, leveraging technology, leveraging blockchain ledgers, and really doing this from the ground up, you would think that there's a lot of opportunity here, and I think the lack of consensus is actually very damaging to the innovation. And I think this is an example, and this is even within my own party, where I think that's really hurting the innovation. I was looking statistically, 30% of Black people own crypto, 27% of Hispanics compared to 20% of Americans. So it's like just those numbers there let me know that there's a real opportunity to really have financial inclusion and technology innovation. But this lack of consensus, not only with DNR, but with D&D, is really going to stifle that. And that's what worries me, and I think there is a lot of opportunity. You don't want to move too fast where you start breaking things. By the same token, given where we are, I think this has a lot of opportunity, but that disagreement will stifle innovation and slow things down, and unfortunately has the potential benefit of not benefiting anyone.
Tony, you want to?
Yeah, I love everything you're saying, Megan. In particular, the point around access and inclusion that I think is, in many senses, low-hanging fruit when it comes to currency and finance, as Jeff is saying, because I think there's an opportunity around local currencies that speak to the flow of value within a locality, within a particular community that often has under current systems, we've seen local banks being hollowed out, bought up essentially for their databases, so that the larger banks can be doing their trading based upon that data. And you've had the hollowing out of local finance. So I think local currencies are one really, really interesting low-hanging fruit piece. And the other piece related to access inclusion is analogous, which is related to education and credentialing, because I think in the same way, certain kinds of institutional credentialing systems are less accessible and inclusive, and the ability to have in a sense a much more decentralized, distributed system where people are vouching for other people's capabilities and skill sets. That's a piece that can come from the bottoms up, and then government can look at the way that I think it licenses a whole series of different trades and professions, and look at the ways in which they might actually update that licensing process to take into account some of this bottoms up emergent recognition of somebody's actual skill sets.
Let me pivot the conversation a little bit, just in the interest, we only have about 9 minutes left, to address maybe going back to this disruption of industry and what directors can do or think about. So, even in the example that we just gave, there are niche players in the world of finance, in the world of banking, and in other areas that have tried to, sometimes with a great deal of success, accommodate the structural racism that exists in the system as it is, and cater to particular individuals and communities to help make up for that. If you had a perfect system that displaced that, in theory, that niche role goes away. And on the one hand, that's a very good story because it's kind of a universal good. On the other hand, they get disrupted. So this plays out in big industries and little industries. What should a director do at this moment in time when thinking about it? Maybe, Megan, we might go back to your working in parallel. What should a director do strategically, asking questions in an environment in which maybe some of their business lines, which may not be obvious, become obsolete as the world of government arguably becomes much more efficient, or these transparency issues resolve gaps in service, et cetera? So how does a director strategically sit on top of this idea, whether it's questions or actions or ways to think? So
that's a great question. And I think, just as hard as it is to get that consensus in government, I'm sure it'd be difficult to get that consensus at the director level. I think that Tony had mentioned something around climate disclosures and around your supply chain. I think what we're seeing, obviously, is a lot of pressure on corporate governance and to kind of change the model. I think in our prep, I talked about benefit corporations and B Corps, and you see this emergence too, where it has, I think, on both sides, where you have companies who are expressing their values and are putting stakeholder governance over shareholder governance, and perhaps that approach allows you to take into account all these different frictions and opportunities. It might then impact your return on that investment, but kind of reviewing the corporate governance and your motivations, and if benefit corporations or kind of those opportunities might fit in. Now on the flip side, you have some folks in Washington who feel like companies are like now greenwashing, where they're maybe like overstating some of these benefits and their ESG disclosures to meet these things. So once again, you see that tension even in the opportunity to do more. But I think from a board of governors perspective, from a DC perspective too, I think people are wanting more from the corporate governance standpoint, and really kind of thinking through, are there things for the bigger good that we can be for that might slow us down in the short term, but might solve some of these more pressing issues. And I think the other thing I would just say is, once again, government, I mean, it's easy to be critical of government, but it's a lot harder to embrace some of these things, and really try to figure out, can this work? Can I make this happen? Or is this a complete non-starter? And I think just kind of trying to embrace a new way of thinking, even if you still get to know, I think that also demonstrates a commitment, and at least demonstrates the ability to at least try to solve some of these bigger issues.
It's interesting. If a board has the attitude with management, obviously, of a more effective government can provide services or opportunities that might not otherwise be available, how do you embrace that? That's one frame which can be very, very productive. I like that as a positive takeaway. Jeff, what would you, I know you're actually doing this, what do you advise maybe even bigger institutional kind of players in the ecosystem? Like, what do you tell those boards to think about?
Well, Dan, it's interesting, and I'll broaden out a little bit from the topic and say, with the world moving so quickly, everyone needs to evolve, and that includes company and corporations. particularly the large existing one. And too often what I find, and hopefully not many of the directors on this call, is people have fallen in love with the product that they deliver right now versus the mission or purpose of what they're trying to achieve. So to use your example, Dan, if you are existing in the current infrastructure to address notions of equality, that's great. And if you fall in love with that specific answer that you have, yeah, you're open to disruption. But if you look at it from the standpoint of the mission you're trying to achieve, and Megan, those are some phenomenal statistics about crypto ownership, what you'll recognize is there's an entirely new world where the impact of your mission can impact so many more people. So if boards of directors say, what is our mission and purpose, and how do we embrace the opportunity associated with it to be a much bigger answer in the world, I think you'll see opportunity everywhere. If you fall in love with, well, this is the way we do things today, and we don't really want to change, and we're scared, that's where you suffer the risk of disruption.
Interesting. Half the punchlines of all of our webinars are have a change and disruption mindset. Like no matter what the webinar topic is, which is a little odd. But I'm going to switch gears and have Nancy put up the final poll. And while that's happening, I would love for you guys to be thinking about the 1 minute concise answer to the last question, which is, what is a takeaway action item? Either do this, read this, ask this questions, and or here's a prediction about something in the near future for directors with directors in mind. We'll give it a couple seconds here. Let us get up to like 15 or 20 in terms of total respondents to see what people think is like this is positive impact when used by the government. We've got blockchain and AI machine learning kind of neck and neck. Which is no surprise. And then there's a very long list. Again, we apologize for forcing you to pick one and from forcing you to pick from our selections, but it's helpful for us to understand. So machine learning and AI, and then virtual and augmented reality as the kind of distant tied third, and then blockchain. Okay, so Tony, I'm going to go to you first if you're willing to do it. I would love for you to give us a takeaway. Either do this, think this, read this, and if you like, a prediction. Predictions can also be, don't pay attention to this because it's going to come to nothing. Stop wasting your time. Tony, you first.
Well, thank you, Dan. I'm going to take this opportunity to do a quick plug for a online gathering we're going to be doing at Stanford or from our Codex blockchain group, all about DAOs. And so we're going to touch on some of the climate aspects. We're going to touch about how DAOs can help governments, how DAOs can help corporations, and digging into this aspect of composable governance. So really, if there was one prediction, it would be that DAOs are actually going to impact pretty much every single kind of organizational form we have over the next 5 years. And yeah, just advise our audience to get up to speed with that, because I think it might actually help everybody keep up with change, having this kind of an ecosystem around you to sort of give you input on a more regular basis.
The world is turned upside down in a good way. Like the academic on the panel just went for the close. This is fantastic, Tony. So while we're at it, we're going to make sure that Nancy posts a URL for that. So maybe give that to her, Tony, and we'll circulate it to all the attendees. I appreciate that plug, a worthwhile session. Megan, I'm going to have you go next and maybe give us we have 2 minutes left. So 1 minute of do this, read this, ask this, or here's the prediction.
I'll be even shorter. I think help the government understand that disruption will not limit access. Government is really trying to manage the disruption, the innovation, and the regulation. And I think getting them comfortable that the disruption will actually benefit and not do harm, and really walking them through that, and how your company will actually not take advantage of anything, but actually move the ball forward. So I think disruption can be good, but I think there's some hesitancy. So work with government to understand the possibility of that disruption.
Yeah, a quick glance at our attendees list. We've got a couple of big companies with big GR functions. So that's an actionable takeaway, which is have the GR, sing the positive tone of disruption can all be our friend. And Jeff, you get the last word.
Tony, first of all, I'm going to come to your event, so I expect an invite. Secondly, the thing I always advise is get your hands dirty. It's there's lots to read, there's lots to go out and to think about, talk about, a lot of think tanks around this. You have to experience it yourself. You have to have your companies building things themselves. And to Megan's earlier point about talent development, it's because you need to know how this applies to you, your company, in reality, not in theory, but in reality. And the only way to do that is to try, to fail, to experiment, to invest those dollars. I've not seen a company discuss their way into AI leadership or blockchain leadership. It's always because they were doing something and trying something about it. So get your hands dirty and go out and put your hands on the keyboard, or conceptually put yourself out in that environment and make it real to you.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I just want to thank you three and thank our audience for spending the time with us. This was great. As always, we could spend another 2 days turning this into its own workshop, but thank you for the time and thanks for joining us.